So our speaker today is Paul Clements, and he is one of the original founders of the Climate Change Working Group at Western, where he directs the Master of International Development Administration and Graduate Certificate on Climate Change Policy and Management Programs. So Paul will be speaking today on international reforms needed for the U.S. to take responsibility for its carbon pollution with a focus on climate migrants.
Great. Thanks very much, Nikki. And it's great to see so many friends here. So I'm going to talk about climate justice and climate migrants. And I believe that uh, the many tens of millions of climate migrants today are the largest, most significantly victimized population by climate change. And I think that any perspective on climate justice, well, the climate justice needs to give their well-being an emphasis, but that has not happened, and I think it's critical. Uh, it's something that I've worked on for a while, and I'm going to describe today kind of how it's part of my broader life project. Some of you will have heard bits and pieces of this before, and my apologies for repetition, but might give a slightly larger context. But also, if I know KCCC, is concerned with climate justice, and if KCCC were interested in participating one way or another, then I would welcome that participation. So perhaps this presentation can give a background for that as well. Uh, so to start off with how it fits into my personal background, just very quickly, I spent most of my childhood in Hong Kong, did my 10th and 11th grade in India. I was fortunate to do my undergraduate work at Harvard. I went on and did 5 years of development work as a Peace Corps volunteer and other work in the Gambia, West Africa. Did my graduate work at Princeton. And in 1996, I came to Kalamazoo to teach at Western, where I have been since that time. In terms of my sort of intellectual and professional journey, I've started off focusing on international development and roles in justice, and that's led me to the topic of international climate justice that I've been working on for some time. Um, this kind of starts in India when I was in 10th and 11th grade. My mom and dad were working in the slums of Bombay, and we were part of an organization that was starting village development projects in very poor villages in many places in India. So I used to spend almost all my holidays either in the slums of Bombay or in poor villages in India, which in those days that was very serious poverty. Also, so when I started college, I was in an interdisciplinary social science program, and I wanted to do international development. That was my focus. As a child of the 60s, I was interested in social justice, and I had the chance to take a class with the leading political philosopher of, I think, really the 20th century, John Rawls, his theory of justice. And that's been fundamental both to my political and academic work in a variety of ways. If you're not familiar with Rawls, which many people are not, one of his central ideas he calls the original position. And that is, he says, if we want to think about what would be the right principles of justice, say for a country, we should imagine that we don't know our position in that country. We don't know if we're rich or poor, black or white, male or female. And from this imagined position of ignorance, we should imagine what principles of justice we would select from that perspective. If we apply that to climate change, then if we didn't know if we were Americans or climate refugees or whatever, then that's an orientation that I've brought to the question of climate justice. Um, so uh, I've continued to work at Princeton. I was focusing on international development. I did a PhD in public affairs. My dissertation was on the World Bank, USAID, and CARE. And in my teaching and in my research, I've continued to sort of study and understand the international foreign aid institutional framework, which now has become the international climate change institutional framework. So I have a fairly sort of deep academic and practical perspective in that area. Uh, well, as I think Nikki mentioned, I was one of the co-founders of Western's Climate Change Working Group back in 2012. It became apparent to me that in the international development space, whereas in my younger years we'd focused on the challenges of poverty, the challenges of poverty were moving very much in the right direction, but the challenges of climate change were coming up as and were clearly going to be the biggest challenge for developing countries in the future. And I'd already started sort of publishing in that area by 2012 and presenting with Ron Kramer and Dave Perot. And so this was sort of what got me to uh, we thought that climate change ought to be part of Western's program. Many of you know that in 2014 and 2016, I was the Democratic candidate for Congress, the Michigan 6th District, and that informed my political perspective. I just mentioned a 2015 publication, Rawlsian Ethics of Climate Change, is just one example of my publications. I've done a lot of sort of academic work on in political philosophy and ethics and so on, and in applied areas on Rawlsian climate justice. 2024, last year, I had two publications that sort of put together my current perspective. A book chapter on climate risk, climate justice, and why we need stronger climate governance, basically about the failures of the international system. And I'll say more about that. And then this other one on international climate migrant policy and estimates of climate migration, because again, these have been very problematic, and I'll also say more about that. Right now, I have under contract a book, but I'll have to finish next year. I've written most of it, where the working title is Reforming Political Science and Civic Education, Practical Reason, Climate Justice, and Democratic Citizenship, where basically I argue that for democracy to work, and for any kind of promotion of social justice, citizens need to have certain analytic and cognitive capacities, let's say, to promote social justice, that they don't get from experience alone. And that for democracy to succeed, some citizens have to choose to promote social justice. I think that people naturally have a sense of right, and they naturally have a sense of a basis for a conception of justice. We don't have to worry about that. But if they don't have the cognitive and the analytic toolkit for focusing on the critical issues in society, then they won't orient their projects to this. And that political science has a specific role in our society for supplying students. And this is not what political science has tried to do. I use climate justice as my case study and about how the work for climate justice hasn't focused on, I think, the core issues. But in the context of that discussion, I also argue that if we look at United States democracies today, they've traditionally been justified. Why do we want to have democracy? Not because going to vote is virtuous in itself, but because historically the thought has been that democracy is the best form of government that we're aware of to have a chance of promoting liberty and equality. And in the French Revolution, they added fraternity. Liberty and equality have been the purposes to justify democracy. But I'm arguing that in our world today, capitalism's destruction of the environment and climate change and such undermine the possibility of liberty and equality moving forward. That for liberty and equality in democracies to be sustained, if we don't take better care of the environment, if we don't address climate change, then liberty and equality are also going to be cannot be sustained in coming generations, and that therefore environmental sustainability needs to be added as a third or fourth fundamental pillar value for democracy. And that's just part of the argument of the book. Because so many of our carbon pollution, it's an international externality. When we generate carbon pollution, the harms fall mostly on people outside our own country. Climate justice, environmental sustainability requires stronger international climate governance. And so that's then sort of part of the argument for why we need stronger international climate governance. In a certain respect, then, the Climate Migrant Symposium that I just basically I was the primary organizer of it, in terms of looking at how we can better support climate migrants, is an implementation of this project in terms of trying to sort of enhance the discussion about how the international community can better support climate migrants. So when I look broadly at imperatives for climate justice globally and here in the United States as well, that I think that either we're going to have stronger global climate governance, or else we're going to have what people talk about as the armed lifeboat, that our international systems for addressing climate change are failing today. And they're failing for good reasons that I'll talk about. But if we don't get stronger international governance, then what we're already seeing is moving to a situation where the wealthier countries, such as the United States, just try to protect their own privilege and block others from coming in and let those sufferers suffer, and whatever happens to them is their own business. So I think that we need, if we don't have stronger climate governance, I think that's where we're going, and that's the direction we're going today. When I say stronger global climate governance, I mean such things as the international institution being able to tax countries like the United States to cover the costs of the harms that they impose on other countries. Not a very popular topic, but I think we need to go there. I think the US and other developed countries must take responsibility for their carbon pollution, which they're not doing today. And that in terms of the immediate focus of that, because the biggest population of most unjustly victimized people is climate migrants, support for climate migrants is an appropriate focus for developing this broader theme of developed country support by addressing the most critical current need. So I think that there's a need then for US citizens to promote support for climate migrants as part of US responsibility for climate change. We hear a lot about people from victimized populations going to these big meetings, and that's very important. But we have to have Americans saying, look, this is our job. This is our responsibility. And the US climate justice movement really hasn't taken that up. So I think there are four problematic discourses that I see in my academic work and my political work that inform this discussion. One is that the public discourse on climate change doesn't recognize the extent of climate harms. Secondly, that the international climate discourse, the main international institution for discussions and for making rules and stuff is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And it's certainly failing to achieve its own goals. But while it's failing to achieve its own goals, it particularly fails to prioritize support for climate migrants. This is largely because the UNFCCC, like other UN-related organizations, is a club of governments. And it's the interests of the respective governments, such as the United States, that determine what it's going to do. And well, I'll talk about that. But also, the academic and scientific climate change literature are mostly too narrow. They're siloed by academic topic and subfield and not integrative of the big picture. I spent a lot of my time reading various academic work on the science, on the social science, on the policy side, and most of it's fairly narrowly focused and probably doesn't have much influence. I think that there is generally a calculation fetish based on inadequate quantitative evidence in the academic literature. People want to focus on the numbers rather than addressing the substantive questions, and I'll address this in the area of climate migration. Then finally, another problematic discourse is that the US climate justice activist discourse is 99% domestic US focus. And I completely get that people want to focus on something which they know where they can make a difference. And it's hard to see how we make a difference in international negotiations. Nevertheless, I think that the neglect of the international picture, international climate justice, is dire and essentially means that climate justice will fail if it is continued to be neglected. That without global climate justice, domestic justice fails. So this is an issue. So if we look at US rejection of responsibility for our carbon pollution, it's not a new thing. It started at the very beginning, the very establishment of international negotiations in 1992, with when the UNFCCC got started. The poor island states that knew that they were going to get submerged by climate change with sea level rise, if it kept going, they said, look, developed countries have to take responsibility. And the United States led the developed countries saying, no way, we're not going to take responsibility. And that became basically written into the rules of the UNFCCC as they moved forward. The first time the UNFCCC tried to institute any kind of um, global climate action just among developed countries, the United States rejected participation. So we did not join the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997. The Europeans did. They moved forward. But without the United States, it didn't have much effect. The main international institution for set of the rules, international rules governing climate change that we have today is the Paris Agreement. Um, and it was from 2015. But once again, all of the commitments in the Paris Agreement are based on so-called nationally determined contributions in terms of reducing carbon pollution, in terms of helping other countries, in terms of doing anything. And these national determined contributions are all voluntary, and there's no enforcement. And so if you fail to make a contribution, there's no consequence. If you say you're going to make a contribution, but you don't, there's no consequence. And so the fact that the UNFCCC, the international community, is failing to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement of limiting global warming to between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius really shouldn't come as a big surprise. They've never been a strong enough system of rules to get countries to do the things that would be necessary for that. Obviously, we've seen in both 2017 and 2027, Trump withdrawing the United States from the Paris Agreement, which any country can do. And then, you just don't have to do anything because you don't want to. And of course, here we've seen Trump canceling Biden's still inadequate climate change policies. But the point I'm making is that US rejection of responsibility is not a Trump phenomenon. It's been since the beginning of the whole discussion and all the way through the international discussions. So if we look at the UNFCCC structure for climate action, from 1992, it's been defined in terms of mitigation, reducing carbon pollution, and adaptation, adapting to the effects of various harms from climate change. But where that really started to become more practical, besides each country's internal action, basically the developed countries like the United States can pretty much do this on their own, whatever they choose to do. But the developing countries that need to be part of this, they're going to need help. And that was understood from the very start. So that was written into 1992 into the basic first UNFCCC, but it wasn't until 2009 that it got the kind of momentum where at that time Hillary Clinton went down to the meeting and I forget where that was, and they set a goal for by 2020 to have $100 billion per year of climate finance from developed countries, helping developing countries in their mitigation and adaptation. Then we see in 2015, the framework established with the Paris Agreement with the I say imaginary 1.5 degree target, because that was the target people have talked about it so much, but it's never had serious implementation measures. So from day one, there was very little chance that it would be achieved. The Paris Agreement reaffirmed the $100 billion target and also instituted a principle of a balance between mitigation and adaptation. So apparently roughly half the resources would go for reducing carbon pollution, half the resources would go for helping developing countries for adaptation. But that really didn't happen. Most of the money, because the developed countries wanted to go more for mitigation, most of it has gone for mitigation, much less for adaptation. And adaptation money has not been very well spent. Also in 2015, they agreed to establish a task force on displacement, which was the first institution of the UNFCCC, of these international organizations, that specifically focused on displacement and climate migrants. But it's only to give advice and with no operational budget. So that kind of reflects the institutional neglect of climate migrants in the international system. We didn't reach the $200 billion target at 2020, but it was reached and exceeded in 2022 with $122 billion, mostly for mitigation, but was virtually none for climate migrants. Again, although By then, it was very well known that they were the biggest population of most seriously victimized people. I'll say this again, this is partly because UNFCCC is an institution of national governments, and climate migrants have very little political influence. Also, I will point out that most of this $122 billion or whatever it is channeled pretty inefficiently through established aid agencies, which is what I teach about. In 2023, there was a loss and damage fund established in principle, in addition to addressing mitigation adaptation. Um, and for the very first time, it explicitly stated support for displaced persons as one of its purposes, among many purposes. Although previous to that, support for climate migrants could well be considered under adaptation, just it wasn't much. Um, Last year, in 2024, the goal of $100 billion a year was raised to $300 billion a year of climate finance by 2030 from the developed countries. The United States was part of this. And so even though Trump, is away from this, I think that it's reasonable to expect. I'm sorry, this should be 20, I made a mistake here. It should be by 2035, not 2030. I think we should reasonably expect the developed countries between now and 2035 will significantly raise their support for developing countries. The developing countries asked for $1 trillion, over $1 trillion, and that's really what's needed. The developed countries said, no, we can't do $1 trillion, but we can do 300 billion. I think we can expect that the current expenditure to increase, even though right now, this year, there's a big problem in terms of not enough resources. However, there is still less than $1 billion committed to the loss and damage fund, which hasn't even started spending money. So there's no indication today that much of this $300 billion will be spent to address the most seriously victimized community, the climate migrants. So part of the issue is that the international community in so many areas of climate change just doesn't get the numbers right. If we look at the numbers people have used in terms of estimates of climate migrants, the most prominent sources have been Norman Myers in 1991, and then again in 2001. He first estimated there could be as many as 150 million people displaced by climate change from their homes by floods and droughts by 2050. So the idea is by 2050, what kind of problem are we looking at here if we don't take stronger action? So he started off suggesting it might be 150 million. Later, he suggested, no, maybe it'd be 212 million. And that became the standard reference that was cited all over the place, roughly 200 million by 2050. When people said, how big is this problem? That was the kind of number people used. But Norman Myers was very clear that his estimates were very rough estimates. There wasn't good data at that time. So the very first study of this that uses sophisticated statistical techniques is a World Bank study called Groundswell, where they did the first volume in 2018, the second volume in 2021. And because it was the World Bank, because they used fancy statistics, once they produced it, this became the standard reference. It just placed Myers. Everyone quotes the Groundswell numbers. In 2018, they said 143 million potential climate migrants by 2050 in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, just in these three regions. This number, in their analysis, represented the upper 95th confidence interval for their pessimistic scenario. So they're not saying this is like the probable number. They're saying this is the very worst case scenario based on their analysis. And so, but everyone just started saying, oh, World Bank says, sometimes they say 20 million, sometimes 200 million, sometimes they say 216 million, but that was the number that still everyone has been using as how serious this problem might get. Well, the problem with Groundswell, when I first read it, this became apparent to me, was that it was not trying to address total climate migration. The whole study is based only on three drivers of slow onset, not even sudden onset displacement. Water availability in terms of cubic meters per second of river discharge, crop production in terms of yields and tons per hectare of maize, wheat, rice, and soybeans, and sea level rise in terms of population living on land up to 1 and 2 meters above sea level, respectively, for their low and high end climate change scenarios. And We can talk about the calculation of these things and how they project into the future. There are kind of issues there. But the main issue is that these are only three of the drivers, not necessarily even the main drivers of how people are displaced from their homes. And so even though the White House and the European Union, United Nations were all using this number to represent possible future climate migration, it's kind of a funny number. It wasn't even intended. And the World Bank didn't try to stop this. They were quite happy and they've also used it in this way. So basically underestimating the problem. So this is what I was focusing on in my article that I published last year, and that has I went on this morning. Apparently, it's had 7,939 views so far. Where I think, all right, if we're going to take a better look at what's potential sort of bad case scenario climate migration by 2050, let's look at all the drivers. One little problem with the groundswell study was for looking at sea level rise, they used satellite data from NASA from developing countries that couldn't tell the difference between the top of a tree and land or the top of a house and land. And so they vastly underestimated the number of people because the number of people living on the low-lying land, essentially. Um, there are articles that correct for this and see that it's roughly, you have to multiply roughly by 3 times the numbers that they came up with. But also, they don't disaggregate among the three different drivers of climate migration. And also, there's a kind of a worst case scenario. So, putting all these together, if we're just going to make a rough estimate, and I'm still conservative probably from their three drivers, I'm saying maybe 220 million, just ballpark. Then the other drivers, well, we'll talk about extreme heat, that this is particularly, whereas the groundswell drivers focus mostly on rural areas, extreme heat is most harmful in cities because also they collect a lot of the heat. That's where elderly people live in large numbers without air conditioning. That's where a lot of people have to work outside. And in low in very hot countries, it's already getting to where many days of the year you can't go outside. And if we get spikes of heat, we may well see cases where there are widespread, I mean, millions of deaths from heat waves. But I think we should expect to see significant migration from extreme heat. Besides the crops that they talk about, declines in other crops, particularly declines in pasturage, nomadic populations that move their animals around, desertification, glacial land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, salinization. These are all recognized as drivers of migration that are excluded from the groundswell analysis. They only look at slow onset and sudden onset weather disasters, particularly floods and storms, are also known to be major drivers of migration. But here the problem with the data is the data only looks at short-term migration from these sudden onset disasters. And there's no data on how many people are permanently displaced because they have no home to go back to after the flood or after the storm. And so again, I do some work on that and say maybe we'd be talking by 2050, maybe 180 million. So all these are very rough estimates, but they're mostly pretty conservative. And you put them together, and rather than 200 million as sort of a ballpark, we should be talking about 500 million, which is 5% of the world population, as on our current track, quite likely climate migration by 2050. And we know from the Climate Migrant Symposium, if you went to some of those panels, how terrible the lives are. What a great loss it is to lose your home, to go into a slum at the bottom of the barrel with no assets and no skills, which is the situation of most of those migrants. These calculations do not include increased migration due to increased conflict. They don't include the possibility of state collapse due to climate change and the migration that we caused by that. They're based on IPCC, the standard estimates of climate change, but James Hansen, the strongest climate scientist that I know, he thinks the IPCC estimates are way too low. And I think he's right. If the standard IPCC estimates are too low, then we're going to have much stronger storms, much more heat waves, much more warming, then these numbers also go up. So again, makes them maybe conservative. So the basic argument here is that there's going to be all the climate migrants, the international system is ignoring them, and they're the biggest victims. And both in terms of any kind of climate justice, but also just in terms of human, capital and efficiency, for people who are farmers not to be able to get new skills to make new lives, for their children not to be educated, not to get basic health care, is just so problematic that there are all these resources out there going up to $300 billion, $350 billion, $350 billion by 2035. And a significant part of these resources ought to go to support climate migrants. And that was why I organized, with the support from the Climate Change Working Group at Western, the Climate Migrant Symposium, was to sort of build the knowledge and political support. Well, not much of political support, but to build institutional capacity for supporting climate migrants. And for those of you who were able to participate, I appreciate it. I think it came off pretty well. We had no idea how this was going to work. When I started in this back in December with a climate change working group, we were pretty clueless, but partly because I was arguing that the international community has been neglecting it and needs to focus on it. And it actually is beginning to focus on it, but not nearly enough. When I reached out to different organizations, people said, yes, that's right. We need to do something like this. So once we got it together, we got partnership with the Global Center for Climate Mobility and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. These are two of the major international organizations in the UN system that deal with climate migration because they said, yes, we need to support this once we had the symposium as a going concern. So we had it for 3 days, 110 speakers, 392 participants from 52 countries, and the recordings are available. So I thought that was sort of one way of promoting this agenda. So what's needed for climate justice? To promote US and developed countries, if we're going to have climate justice, we need to promote US and developed country responsibility for our carbon pollution. We need to promote more and better support for climate migrants. We need to bring an international dimension to local climate action organizing. And my thought has been that one way to do that would be to develop an international advocacy organization, mostly of developed country citizens, advocating for support for climate migrants, helping to actually maybe even write proposals and make connections with agencies in Bangladesh and in Somalia who can do the work so that some of this $300 billion can go to them with good project designs, but based on the principle that we in the United States and other developed countries, this is not charity, this is our responsibility. And as a sort of a mechanism to also on the political side promote U.S. responsibility, which so far our government has rejected. This is something I've been working on. I'm going to keep working on it. And if KCCC wanted to help, they would be welcome. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And just very briefly, I think I have another minute or two, a couple minutes here. I'm going to take you to the website for the Climate Migrant Symposium. This sort of is still the website that we had back in the day, so it's still sort of like describing it as something going forward. But here's the session library. And what you can see here is we have all the panels, all the sessions from that 3-day symposium. And so part of the issue I know is that most Americans, not quite understandably, don't know much about climate migration. Well, now if you want to learn about it, here's a handy source. uh, uh, and I would be happy to direct anyone who's interested to some of the panels that might be particularly helpful and interesting and relevant. Okay, thanks. And may I open it up for questions now?
Yeah, Paul, this is kind of a nuts and bolts question about your assessment, your estimates of numbers of migrants, how do you handle the kind of interaction terms between the different drivers? I mean, I totally understand that there are more drivers than what Groundswell um, looked at, but these other drivers don't occur in a vacuum, right? You get heat waves at the same time as you get extreme storms, just as an example. Just wondering how to handle those interaction terms in terms of getting accurate numbers.
Well, the first thing is these are not accurate numbers. Um, part of the thing about the groundswell study was that its statistics is based on data of how many people moved from like one part of a country to another associated with changes in those three variables between 1980 and 2010. Um, and so there, because you can get data on that, they're able to produce numbers in a regular statistical way. If we look at all the other drivers that I'm talking about, we don't have that data. And so it's not even data. It's just looking at the information that's available and saying what are plausible, reasonable estimates, recognizing that they'll need to be corrected and fixed over time. For example, we've never seen the level of heat that we're seeing now, for extended periods of time in these cities. It hasn't happened in history. So you can't have data on the level on the problems we're going to have. And so, certainly interactions, we're just not there. Um, Probably some of the most significant interactions would be between climate stress and various kinds of violence, whether it be state violence or one thing and another. And that's completely excluded from, and no one has data on that. So we know these interactions are there, but the point is that we shouldn't take these estimates as statistical estimates with any kind of precision. We should take them as giving us a reasonable picture of the broad numbers, going again, 25 years forward. We know there are tens of millions now, but also the data is very poor. We don't even know where these tens of millions are. I mean, we know that they mostly stay within their home countries. Um, uh, so again, the point is that in terms of international responses, the international response for 200 million people compared to international response for 500 million people is very, very different. And 200 million is just not the right number for that. That's kind of the argument. And it may well be much higher than 500 million if these interactions are more serious. To generalize your point, there's the whole concept of sort of the cascading impacts of climate change. And this is another area where there are thousands of studies of different impacts of climate change based on local data. But what you say is completely correct. And that is to say, each one of these impacts over time tends to then interact with other ones. And you get these cascading impacts. And there's no studies that systematically assess cascading impact because we don't have methods for that because it's just too complicated. And it hasn't happened yet, or it has happened, but we don't know all the different ways. And so again, this is just one of so many ways in which this sort of fixation on the numbers rather than on the substantive questions has minimized the problems. Um, and I know I'm talking about in terms of climate migration, but it's happened in many other areas as well.
How
So,
do you take into consideration the cities like Tehran, they say, is on the verge of collapse because of water. Johannesburg went through this, Mexico City went through this. And what happens then if the cities literally get to day zero of having no water? How does this, how do we account for things like that happening?
Well, if we were to look at how that would fit within the current framework, um, that would the water, the river water um, portion of the World Bank's groundswell would be what would apply to that. But this is one of so many areas where just to take the data from 1980 to 2010 and then project it indefinitely is also problematic. That's what they do because that's the only thing statistics can do. But when we recognize that these are that the trend is not a linear trend, that when you pass thresholds, things get way worse, like what you're talking about of cities breaking down, that it becomes apparent that the data doesn't reflect those. And again, that the current estimates are, and even my estimates, are probably too low.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna go with Tim before you, Steve, since it's his first question.
Well, I don't know. This probably doesn't do a better job of addressing your focus on migrants, but I'm wondering if you are aware of an organization called the Global Commons Alliance. And this is primarily a scientifically oriented group. And it takes the broader view that I assume you're aware that in this view, climate change is only one of a number of issues that we face globally, which are referred to as planetary boundaries. And also, this approach of this group takes into account also the tipping points in the climate system. So I'm just wondering if you are aware of this organization or approach. I'm not quite sure how to. I would say it's trying to take the place, in a sense, of the UNFCCC and the COP meetings in terms of bringing in a broader perspective on what is sometimes called ecological overshoot. Do you have any thoughts or comments about that?
Well, I'm not familiar with the specific thing you're talking to this organization, but it's not possible. It's they can bring in knowledge and they can bring in ideas, but the UNFCCC is the only actual organization of the world's governments that makes collective decisions about how to respond to climate change. In the book that I'm working on, I recognize the climate crisis as only one of many of the environmental challenges that capitalism has brought on and that our governments fail to address. A lot of them are domestic within countries, but many of them are international, where you know uh, factories or whatever in one country produce harms that affect other countries. And this is why we need stronger global governance. Right now, the UNFCCC is that global governance, and it's inadequate. So I think that rather than talking about trashing the UNFCCC, starting something from scratch, that would be one way, but that would be, might not make a lot of sense. That the question would be how to strengthen the UNFCCC. And again, I'm focusing mainly on the climate crisis because it's I think the core crisis, but we could also bring in law of the sea and extinctions of species for other causes and other issues, and they might need their own organizations. But the point is that all of these require governance that, the United States in particular has firmly rejects. But I think that without international governance that has teeth, which we don't have today, that there's no way to solve these environmental challenges, of which climate change is a leading challenge. So sort of the whole thing on climate migration is sort of looking at the problem and trying to have a better idea of the problem. But in terms of solutions, and so let's for dealing with climate migration, let's currently work with the systems that we have. And the systems we have is coming up to $300 billion a year. So let's talk about how to use that money better, right? But those systems also are inadequate. We need a stronger UNFCCC, and certainly, Tim, the organization you're talking about and their analysis would my analysis would support theirs would support mine. They would be completely congruent about the need for this stronger climate governance. And just how that would work, I don't know. That raises new questions.
Tom?
Okay, well, I guess my question is always in my mind the one of implementation. How do you get where you're, the ideal, we need a stronger international organization and a lot of more commitment uh, from governments that have the money. But how do we get there? What are the pressure points that that ordinary citizens can use to move things forward? It's bad enough just thinking about the United States, and you put it into global perspective with 180 some nations. It becomes almost overwhelming. So I don't know whether you've thought through that at all, Paul.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly. Well, the first thing is that during the Trump administration, we're not going to see movement in the United States for the national level. But I think that nevertheless, we need to be preparing, we need to be building the, shall we say, people power for when we have a better administration that allows national political change. How to get local people, how to get people involved. I completely understand that for most normal people, Tom, or people around town, the whole idea of climate migrants, helping climate migrants in Bangladesh is completely foreign and something like the dark side of the moon. But what I'm arguing is that that's the situation of climate justice organizations across the United States. And it's well documented in California, where the climate justice, when they talk about international stuff, they talk about um, supporting people like in the rainforest and in uh, in the Amazon and stuff, but they don't have any conception in the historical development of climate justice organizations in California. They don't have any conception of U.S. systematic responsibility for our carbon pollution globally. So I think that this is just a sort of paradigm shift that needs to be promoted among climate justice organizations. And that's why I think that building up the base of knowledge and understanding to be able to provide practical support for climate migrants would be a pathway to doing that. As hard as that pathway is, and it's very hard. But I actually teach this stuff, and my students learn it. Um, and I don't think this is something that basically anyone would want to get involved in. I think it would be people who already have professional experience with organizations, maybe such as in leading organizations, such as in grant writing, such as in, I think that someone who um, who doesn't have professional experience in organizations is going to have a much higher learning curve. But I think someone who does have, let's say who's led the YMCA or whatever, something like that their learning curve for how they could help to provide to get real money to support good projects, for climate migrants, not doing the work ourselves. All this work can be done from your living room with Zoom, basically. You don't have to go anywhere for any of this. There's still a learning curve. It still is not an easy thing, but building the consciousness among American activists of the international dimension of climate justice, I think is essential. And I think this is as good a way as any that I can understand to accomplish that.
Okay, Steve?
Yeah, Paul, are there any countries that are doing better than average job of uh, dealing with migrants? Are there any role models for us to look at? Any examples of policies that have moved the needle?
Well, because what I'm talking about is the international system.
Mhm.
I mean, there's certainly individual countries. You and I are going to go to Scotland and look at, and Scotland is the leader is in the English speaking world in terms of domestic climate action, but Scotland also in their government, in their official documents, they talk about embracing climate justice. And they are also, playing whatever role they can in the international negotiations to push for greater responsibility. And so you would find a more of a sympathetic audience in California, in Scotland, again, people for whom this is part of their discourse already, citizens of Scotland, much more so than Americans. Um, but that doesn't mean that Scotland is doing more to support climate migrants, because they have a few projects, but their projects happen to mostly to be like mitigation adaptation, and they're at relatively small scale. And the issue is how to push the international system to support climate migrants better. And that's not country by country. If we look within developing countries, um, you know, Colombia has done a really good job welcoming not climate migrants, but victimized people from Venezuela, people escaping the Maduro regime. There are some Latin American, some Central American countries, Caribbean countries that have done a pretty well welcoming hurricane victims from nearby countries. So yes, we can certainly find, some cases where developing country governments are more receptive to climate migrants, other kind of migrants than other countries. I mean, Uganda, in principle, has been very supportive, and also in practice, in some respects, of migrants. So there are some countries that are ahead, but in terms of the scale of the problem, uh, it's and the point is that yes, it's great, and we need that work by individual developing countries, but that work by individual developing countries can never possibly be adequate. That we have to have the international support for it to have a chance of being close to adequate. And it's that international support that um, the international system, even those climate change organizations, um, still are not. It's on the agenda, but in terms of action, the action is still tiny.
You think that there's going to be more internal migration than external migration. I believe that you have said that a couple of times. A lot of people also have the philosophy that charity should start at home. Um, and so how do we reconcile the rich countries who also have their internal migrants? Um, how can they support the poorer countries and make sure also that their money is being spent for the migrants? Because a lot of countries have corruption, including this country, and is so, if we do get this pool of $100 billion, how do we make sure it's going where it needs to go?
So we have the pool that recently was $120 billion, and that they want to increase to $300 billion. And almost all of it, 90% of it, is being channeled through the traditional bilateral, multilateral agencies such as World Bank, USAID, Japanese aid, UN organizations, UNDP, UNICEF, etc. And their implementation systems, admittedly, are quite imperfect. And I teach this. I've worked with, in my classes with many of their projects. And I tell my students, this one's really problematic, and this one's pretty good. Um, if we wanted to work with organizations to get better spending for climate migrants from these buckets of money, I would suggest working first with BRAC. It's one of the biggest NGOs in the world. It has a wonderful history from Bangladesh, but now it has an international footprint. They were present in the Climate Migrant Symposium. They presented, and they would be obvious allies in terms of building participatory, strong climate migrant support projects. Um, if we could then work both sides of the aisle, so to speak, in terms of working with organizations like them, and then looking at the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, the different developed international, multilateral, bilateral organizations that then fund this money. That's where I see the opportunity to develop project proposals that work on good principles, and that you can kind of watch, and I can say from my practical experience that I can tell a difference between a good project and a bad project. Not straight off, but over time. And that as a practical challenge, building support for climate migrants, we know what needs to be done. There's some idea of who's out there. Um, you can never get rid of all corruption, but you can pretty much ensure that you have strong systems. And so right
You
now,
say you say we know what should be done, but do we? Okay, if you have a lot of migrants, are we going to be building new cities? Are we because that means that we need to build housing, we need to be building farmland, we need to be building all sorts of infrastructure. And how do we determine what's a safe place to be building this infrastructure? So I'm not even sure that the basics of we know what should be done is accurate.
well, that's what the Climate Migrant Symposium is good for, because there are many, many panels that explicitly address that question. And generally speaking, what you're talking about is, I mean, overwhelmingly, you're talking about people moving from rural areas to urban areas within their home country. And so you're almost always talking not about building new cities, but about supporting within existing cities better infrastructure, better housing, better schools, better um, water supply, so that and then also job training, because people need to have skills that suit the job opportunities in the city, which they don't have. They've been farmers. And so again, these are the tasks, and there are, the money is very small today, but there are still many good organizations. You could find many good examples doing that work. So it's not as though it's zero. It's just, in terms of percentage requirement, it's maybe 2% compared to, what we need. Um, so that's why I say that, when we get to the bigger systems for it, like within each, I've done a lot of work, and I have a student right now from Dhaka, from Bangladesh, and he's doing some work on this. And how you specifically work with the different city government within Bangladesh, within Dhaka, that those details need to be worked out, obviously. But in terms of the basic challenges and approaches to those challenges, um, uh, those are, I mean, you name them. So at that level, at the top level, they're kind of obvious.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Paul. This was a lively, interesting conversation, and I think everybody appreciated it.
Well, thanks. And if anyone wants further discussion, Clements at wmich.edu.
You might be inundated with questions.
I might, but I doubt it.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Nikki. Good to see everybody.